We're going to deal with three things today. First of all, this idea that hip hop causes violence. The second piece that we're going to talk about is whether or not hip hop reproduces and encourages ghetto pathologies, right? And of course, for us, we're going to have to unpack what exactly we consider ghetto pathologies. And then the last piece, and the piece that probably resonates the most for hip hop in the contemporary moment, is hip hop's relationship to misogyny and patriarchy. Ready?
So, with Patricia Rose's book, there's the trifecta comes up. So, in terms of the post-civil rights movement, now we have racially stereotypes. Right? So, does anyone remember the three tropes that were brought up? Yeah, the gangsters, the pimps, the hosts. So, in terms of considering the hip hop artists and how they're presented, those are the three main sort of tropes that are brought up in conversation with highlighted and produced in terms of energy intensive language and artists, right? And so for me, thinking about the stereotypes element, the other problem with these stereotypes is that these hip hop artists, when they discuss, especially the rise of hip hop, right? It's not seen as this is one type of black community. It's almost seen as the black community, right? So when they talk about the state, what kind of language is that allow artists to use? It's not homelessness, it's not joblessness, it's the elements of environment, and then these stereotypes around black men, particularly becoming highly violent, also becoming part of the conversation as a result. So in many ways, is as a social science systemic repercussion of these conversations. So my mind automatically goes to use representations of black crime versus non-black crime, right? When black crime is brought up in conversation with news or music or anything, it is very much seen as something that is a production of the communities they come from. So the conversation, and this is because this is what conflict is like, this is what conflict produces. When you discuss white crime, in mass violence, there is actually more individualistic explanation of this is that individual's personal struggle, right? So the individual is humanized in a way that that you don't see occurring for black individuals. So you see that sort of extension within the hip hop scene in what artists produce, and then the production. And think about class last time. We talked about the fact that black athletes are not only commenting but expected to comment on political and social issues. So they're seen as ambassadors for communities in a way that that white athletes and white celebrities are not. And this really is a consequence of sort of these stereotypes that we see attached to these artists. So you think about who we're paying to see on the stage now, and what kind of lyrics and images come with what they're presented on stage. The fundamental, it's really critical to think about that, especially the systems piece, right?
One of the things we might want to think about, and Patricia Rose opens the book with this, thinking about violence in society. Do we believe as a class that if you consume violent things, it means you're naturally engaged in violent behavior? Or do we make allowances that we believe that when certain kinds of folks consume violent things, those folks are apt to act more violent, and there are other folks in which this stuff doesn't affect? What do you think? Do you believe that consuming violence leads to acts of violence? That if you play video games 12 hours a day that involve folks in violent acts, shooting or what have you, do you think that leads to actual acts of violence? Yes?
I think it depends on the person, because like if someone's a naturally pretty passive person, not prone towards violence, like no amount of playing video games is going to make them violent. violent, but if someone's naturally prone to violence, then video games making it seem more acceptable might allow them to think it's acceptable.
So,
act on violence.
So it reinforces behavior that may already be there.
Yeah.
Right? But do we believe in the absence of that? If someone is a blank, clean slate, do we believe that the consumption of violence will lead to acts of violence?
No.
If that's the only thing that they are consuming, like if you take a child and you only let them consume like violent things, then they're probably not the only thing that they're gonna know. But then when they also evolve and see other things in society, then they know what's right and wrong and they know that violence is not okay.
Let me ask you a question. Did any of y'all ever sing or get taught when you were a kid, Little Rabbit Foo-Foo? Any of y'all know that song? Like, Little Rabbit Foo-Foo, you know, running through the woods, came across some field mice and bopped them on the head. Bop them on the head, bop them on the head. I remember the first time I heard that in daycare with my oldest daughter. She was about 16 months, and I was sitting there going, damn, that's a violent song. Right? But we wouldn't think, right? Because there are ways in which, as kids, whether we're talking about watching cartoons, we're always exposed to this cartoonish animated violence. And in some ways, when we consider some of the violence that's perceived and presented in hip-hop, it's that same form of cartoonish animated violence. But where do you think this argument comes from? That somehow when folks consume rap music that's violent, then it leads to violent acts, right? And of course, there's a long history of this, right? I mean, there are court cases that go on even today, right? Either of folks who were listening to some rap song before they committed a crime, or actual rap artists who are rapping about violence, right, and engage in acts of violence themselves. Like 16-year-old and I have been going back and forth about Mary, you know, over the last month or so, right, driving around with some like dead people in his car, right, making songs about like explaining how he killed a friend. What kind of people do we think American society largely thinks of as capable of violence when they consume violence? Black people, right? And that's connected to a larger historical narrative of black people always already being violent. Black men in particular always already being criminal. So what we see is this relationship between the lyrics of violence and perceptions of black folks. And there are folks who see that as circular, right? That it's like a locked circle of engagement, right? You live a violent life, you listen to violent music, you reproduce that violence over and over, right? But there's another narrative about it. It's about the relationship to the music, to audiences that we perceive as more pure. So how do we think about the ways that hip-hop is consumed, right? And this gets to a great question. So if you were to speculate, what is the percentage of white folks that you think consume hip hop? Yeah, and that's right. Yeah. If we think about a subset of hip hop around gangster, what do we think of the percentage of white folks who consume? 25%.
7.
Got 70 here.
I said 7.
7?
80.
80? So, around 1992, there was a piece done that suggested that 70% of the consumers of gangster rap were white. Now, that number is a little problematic, right? Because, first of all, how can you tell what consumption is? Yes.
70% of white people or 70% of consumers worldwide?
70% of the consumers of gangster rap are white. Yeah, the other thing would be counted. Right. And the number is problematic for a bunch of reasons, right? And this is occurring with the emergence of soundscape, right? Soundscape the software, changed how we report music sales. Up to that point in time, there was individual record stores and other folks who were reporting on their sales. SoundScan, you create the context when you sell a record, and of course, there's now data used. And so what the data suggests, and the reason why you have to unpack it, part of what the data suggests is that 70% of the sales of hip hop were occurring in suburbia. So of course the perception was that if it's occurring in suburbia, it must be white folks, because A, black people don't live in suburbia. And guess what? There are things like buses and cars that people in the hood could take to get to suburban homes. In terms of the fear that's generated in the larger society about their perceptions of what hip hop is and what young white folks might be consuming in the context of listening to it. It creates what we recognize and know as a social panic. The idea that there's something happening in society that is so threatening to the status quo that it has to be controlled. And so what we've seen historically has been a policing of black culture, because black culture has been in the root social panics. In the 1940s around bebop, in the 1950s around rock and roll, which of course is directly derivative of a form called rhythm and blues, right, which is black music. We see the same commentary around hip hop from the 1980s really going forward, that somehow the production of these narratives of violence and sex are creating a social panic in society.
And I think that's what's important, is that people may think that this just has to do with hip hop. But Professor Neal's point is that even before the rise of hip hop, there was panic about other forms of music that black musicians produced. So think about that and sort of tracing the history of music and the panic that it's induced amongst the broader community. This sort of panic is not just unique to hip hop, right? And in that way, I think about violence as, what is it that makes people think that there's something unique about hip-hop in relationship to violence? Is there a unique relationship between hip-hop and violence? Because that's the message that people sort of throw out there, right?
And one of the ways that we can unpack this is to think about who in American society is allowed creative license. Who gets to create stories within a range of ideas and themes, and who isn't allowed to tell those stories? Why are the lyrics of hip-hop artists, if in fact they are violent, perceived as some form of reality instead of simply creative license? When you read Edgar Allan Poe, do we think that he is speaking from an autobiographical standpoint? Why is it that we attach this notion of realness and reality, first of all, to black folks, as if everything's autobiographical, and particularly in terms of violence, right? So even in the case of someone like Melly, and again, we can't escape the fact that he's driving around with a bunch of dead bodies in his car, but outside of that story, why can't his music just simply be him telling a graphic and either gothic story about relationships and murder and what have you? Right? No one thinks that when you go see a Hollywood film, a slasher movie, no one ever thinks that this is some autobiographical depiction of life from the screenwriter or the director. But why do we always think that hip-hop artists somehow are telling the truth? And in fact, we hold hip-hop artists to a level of accountability around authenticity. In fact, in some spaces, we don't see them as being of value as commodities, if in fact, these stories that we perceive as being pathological are true. Right? So we don't know what to do. For instance, a great example of this is like Drake. In the early days of Drake, what are we supposed to do with this dude who's suddenly a rapper, right, who's from Canada, right, and used to be Wheelchair Jimmy on Degrassi, right? Somehow, as he becomes a hip hop artist, we're expecting the level of authenticity in his work that we don't believe because we know the backstory.
So authenticity meaning having served something. So it seems like there's only one kind of Black experience that comes up. And in the questions that have come up in discussion questions, I want us to think about how we in the classroom also make these presumptions in the way we frame our questions and understandings of Black experiences, because it even seems in the way that we're understanding it as a collective, we almost inherently say that there is this struggle piece. Like, so are you no longer Black if you haven't struggled, if you've lived a middle class life?
Is your Blackness validated if you have not gone through Black struggle? Is your Blackness validated, right? And this is a conversation that we're having now around this concept of ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. Are you really Black if your family can't trace their lineage to enslavement in the American South? What happens to lots of folks in that case? Probably more folks than we want to give credit to in that. And one of the things that Trisha Rose talks about is, what if hip hop is both a reflection of violence in the hood and also reproduces that violence, right? Does it have to be one or the other? And one of the things that she talks about, what are exactly the conditions of the ghetto, right? As we kind of segue into a conversation on ghetto pathologies. So in your mind, what's a ghetto? Anybody? How would you describe a ghetto? What are the attributes? Not even a ghetto, because we don't talk about a ghetto. We don't talk about ghettos. We talk about the ghetto. Right? One of Donny Hathaway's most popular songs, The Ghetto. Yes, Todd.
Usually a poor area that tends to look different from the rest of the community once you get the vibe where that ghetto starts. Tends to be an area where violence is increasing.
Mm-hmm. And who generally are in ghettos?
Your African Americans and or poor people.
Who inhabited the original urban ghettos in the United States?
Jews.
Jewish community, right? Which is interesting, right? Because when you live in ghetto communities, you play ghetto games. Go back and look at the rosters of professional basketball in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. The majority of those players are in fact Jewish. Anybody know when the first Black player shows up in the NBA? Guess. Right? And I'm asking that question so that you understand it was a period of time where there weren't any Black players. A little earlier, right? The first Earl Lloyd is like 1950. And now the league, of course, is perceived as being a Black league, right? And that somehow we think that has everything to do with how Black athletes are endowed naturally, right? And so were the same arguments being made about Jewish athletes in the 1930s and 40s when they were the dominant ethnic group in professional basketball. And so when we think about ghettos, right, we think about someplace that's poor, oppressed, and what kind of defines those experiences? We could start with heightened levels of joblessness. What does that look like? What does massive unemployment? And we know that unemployment in Black communities typically the unemployment rate is much higher than it is in white communities. Why might there be high levels of joblessness?
Think about the history of that time, right? Black migration to industrial cities. What happens after that?
Y'all read Manning Marable, right? Why did black folks migrate from the Deep South to cities like Chicago and Detroit and New York and Philadelphia and then later out to the West Coast? Right. What kind of jobs specifically were they pursuing? Factory jobs, right. We're talking about a period of hyper-industrialization in the United States. And many of these factories needed workers that they didn't have. And so there was a need. Literally, there are companies who were encouraging black folks to migrate to the United States, up north, to be able to work these jobs. What happens when factories close? What happens when we see new levels of automation? So that you don't actually need people anymore because you have machines. And we're talking 30 years before AI. Right? We're not even talking about what that's going to look like for the future of work for virtually everybody in this country in the next 20, 30, 40 years. When we're talking about what automation looked like in these factories 40 and 50 years ago, right? What happens to those folks who lose their jobs? Where do they go? What kind of work do they engage in?
And pause to layer that conversation. Why did they move to the neighborhoods they moved to? So this piece on, do people just want to move to these specific neighborhoods? Like, so segregation and the history of segregation layers this experience of when they moved to these industrial jobs. And I'm thinking of Massey and Denton. And Massey and Denton have written this canon. It's old and it's classic and it's a really conservative piece. I think there's been much more, there's newer information on how this process, when folks move to places like Detroit, what happens? White flight? Can anyone explain white flight?
When black and brown people move into what had largely been white neighborhoods, white folks, over a period of time, pack up. Any of you ever seen a stage version of A Raisin in the Sun? Or seeing the film version of A Raisin in the Sun, or even seeing the television version of it with Diddy from about 5 years ago? Raisin in the Sun is a play that was written by Lorraine Hansberry, right? And some of the plays actually autobiographical. It's something that happened to a family member. But this was a black working class family that came into some money, decided that they wanted to leave the hood, and they identified a house in a white suburban space so that they could move their family. The white families in the community came together to basically give the black family money to keep them from moving into their neighborhoods. These kind of covenants happen all the time, right? So that when people actually start to move in, the people who can move, white folks, do. There are always some white folks who couldn't, right? And they stay, right? But this is an ongoing narrative, right? What happens when people with money leave neighborhoods? Right? What is the value of people with money in a neighborhood? Why? Property taxes, right? Most schools in America are paid for, public schools are paid for through property taxes, right? A portion of the money that you pay in taxes for the home that you own goes toward those schools. Right? They also provide other taxes to locales. What happens when people with money leave those neighborhoods? The tax base decreases, the schools get worse, the overall value of the houses in those communities go down because people who can't afford houses obviously can't afford to take care of them, can't afford to take care of the infrastructure. And then, of course, there are no jobs. right? So what do these communities look like? The question is always, because we have this ongoing question about whether or not it is nature or nurture. We have this conversation about whether or not it is somebody's culture or is it a behavior that's the byproduct of social realities. Do ghetto communities look like ghetto communities because this is the culture of the people that live in these communities? Are those communities like that because that's the behavior of folks trying to survive within these conditions? I'll use my favorite example. And it relates to the question of affordable housing. In 1934, 35, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then the First Lady of the United States, and probably the most well-known historical First Lady until Mrs. Obama, broke ground in Detroit in a federally subsidized housing complex called the Brewster Projects. The Brewster Projects are significant to us because, one, it was literally one of the first federally funded housing developments in the United States that was geared specifically towards African Americans. It's also notable because Diana Ross and the other Supremes, Mary Wilson and Florence Ballard, grew up in the Brewster houses in the 1940s, 50s, until they, of course, became the most important group for the Motown label. The idea behind federally housing projects is that it would provide temporary relief for folks who were suffering economically. Always the idea that it would be temporary housing for folks, that you'd be able to come in, live, federally subsidized housing for a couple of years, get yourself back on your feet, and move out. One of the things we've seen about housing projects over the last 40 years is that that's not actually what happened.
Nothing temporary.
You actually see sustained lives, like generations of folks living in the same housing projects. That being said, I want you to consider the architecture of some of this stuff. You have groups of folks that you want to keep segregated from the larger population. You don't want them spread out in different pockets, but you also don't have a whole lot of space. There aren't a whole lot of extra places to build in urban spaces. So how do you house these folks? You house them up. So whether we're talking about the Robert Taylor houses in Chicago, which by the way is where R. Kelly grew up, or places like Cabrini Green, if you ever watched Good Times, right? The Evans family lived in Cabrini Green. So you look at these housing projects in places like Detroit, Chicago, New York, it's all these 16, 19, 22-story buildings. One of the common features of those experiences are elevators that don't work, right? Because if you don't care enough about people that you're gonna house them in these spaces, how well are folks going to caretake those spaces? And so even when an elevator works, and I'm sure there's no one in the room who's ever had this experience before because we're at Duke, of rolling into an elevator, hot summer day, right? You get in the elevator and you realize there's like a pool or something on the elevator floor. And then you do a couple of deep sniffs, right? Anybody got no dogs? And you realize that someone has pissed in the elevator. Nothing quite like the smell of hot piss in an elevator on a summer day. And of course, we normally think about that experience and goes, what's wrong with these people? You decide to go walk in the staircase. Same kind of experiences. What is wrong with these folks? What kind of culture do they have? And so we think about it as kind of pathological behavior. instead of thinking about it as very pragmatic behavior. You're an 8-year-old. Elevators ain't working. You live on the 22nd floor. You got to use the bathroom. Where are you going to use the bathroom? Think about that for a second. Behavior that is generated by the reality of where you live. So we talked about high rates of unemployment. We talked about lack of affordable housing. One of the things that we know about hip-hop's relationship with violence in the 1980s and the early 1990s, particularly around gangster rap, are all these narratives about automatic weapons. How the hell do automatic weapons get into urban communities? Are you telling me that 16 and 17-year-old gangbangers are running some sort of complex system to bring automatic weapons into black communities? Folks who, have never used them before? How do we explain the reality, for instance, of the drug trade in these communities? Anybody? Yes, sir. So that's far too easy. Far too easy just to suggest that it's white people. And quite honestly, Taj, I don't have an answer for them. What we know is that we have this level of militarization almost in these communities, in communities that don't really have the capacity to be able to bring this stuff on their own. Now, crack was a different kind of drug, right? As opposed to, say, cocaine and other things, right? Crack was a thing that you could literally make in your kitchen, right? That was the whole story about crack. Crack was described as the fast food of drugs for a bunch of reasons, right? You can make it really cheaply and easily, and because of the nature of the high, right? You go so high and so quickly, it created this incredible level of addiction that we had never seen before, right? And we know that the crack epidemic of the 1980s wiped out black communities, right? If you are to read the journalism of David Simon, or if you were to watch a series like The Wire, which is a fictionalized account of the work that police officer Ed Burns and Baltimore Sun writer David Simon were doing in Baltimore in the 70s and the 80s, they will give you a picture of life in which, if you're trying to remove people from communities so that you can then take over the physical landscape, right? And think about the city of Baltimore. What do you know about the city of Baltimore? What is the defining feature about the city of Baltimore that now makes Baltimore Baltimore? Anybody knows? So we know that Camden Yards is there, but that comes later. Right? Something had to be there beforehand, right? And what we know about Baltimore is the development of the Inner Harbor. What was around the Inner Harbor before the Inner Harbor became home to a bunch of seafood restaurants and a not great mall and the National Aquarium and Camden Yards? And whatever the name of the football stadium is that the football team, the Ravens, right, after Edgar Allan Poe. So we have these examples of communities that are collapsed and folks are removed from those communities, right, and developers take over those spaces. The use of crack cocaine in these communities is one of the ways that made it easier to remove these folks. So we got violence, we have housing that's not affordable. We have the influx of drugs and guns. And we have hip hop artists who are writing stories about this, telling either their truth or the truth of their communities. And it gets a little complicated. So, case in point, Part of his autobiographical is in part about her relationship with 3000, and of course, as a father of her first child, 7. But think about some of the lyrics of this song. Work ain't honest, but it pays the bills. Sort of the interesting dynamic of urban life in this moment is that you had high rates of supposed joblessness, but a bunch of folks working. Right? Yeah, there were some folks who weren't doing anything, but there were a whole bunch of folks who were working in what we know as the informal economy of urban spaces, primarily selling drugs. And there's a way in which we, of course, moralize about that, as we should, but we can't lose sight of the fact that when there were no jobs, what became an accessible industry, if you will, was the proliferation of drugs in Black communities, right? And we know what kind of narrative this is in the context of hip hop. Jay-Z is Jay-Z, right? Because of that informal economy. Right? So on the one hand, and it's interesting because there's a way in which we might think about this lifestyle as being anti-educational, but she says in the song, right? I was there at his graduation. Right? What happens when you invest in this idea of meritocracy and upward mobility if you're Black, and you go and you get that degree and you come back home and there aren't any jobs for you? And I don't want to say this in ways that you don't misunderstanding what I'm saying, in the sense that I'm not even just talking about jobs that aren't there, but jobs that aren't accessible to people who look a certain kind of way. Right? We're not talking about this happening in a benign context in which folks are coming back and looking for jobs and it's like there aren't any jobs. There aren't any jobs in some of those instances because you're Black.
It made me think of David Pager's work. David Pager's work. So Google her, David Pager, Harvard.
You're late, unfortunately,
Late, unfortunate. May she rest in peace. She passed away recently. She's very young. She does these experiments where you have a white applicant who has a felony. So a white felon versus a Black applicant, no criminal record. 0. Who is more likely to get the job? The white felon.
The white felon. Right, over and over again, right? I wish we could be making this up, right? When you fill out job applications, right, and it gets into a whole conversation about Black respectability, about how you name your kids, right? But even before you get to the point where you can have a job interview, if you got a name like Naheem and Kashim and Kwame or Muhammad or a range of these original and creative names that Black folks give folks, right, you're not going to get an interview because you've already been marked as being different. And different is a complicated thing, because I don't want to suggest that you don't get the opportunity for the job because, right, the institution is just inherently racist, or the job recruiter is inherently racist, but you're talking about white institutions that function in a certain kind of way, and folks who don't fit that culture, the work environment, might be seen as disruptive. It's the reason why, for instance, right, the kinds of professional football coaches that get hired are the kinds of professional football coaches that get hired. Because there's 7 candidates, and the Rooney Rule says that you got to interview at least one Black one. Right? And if you're a good Black coach, it means that you've literally been on a dozen of these interviews and never got a job. But a lot of times the decision is made on what is your rapport with the owner. And typically, what does the owner look like? Robert Kraft. That's before we knew he was a little freaky with it. So you're talking about what is the rapport that a 35 or 36-year-old African American is going to have with a 76-year-old billionaire, as opposed to a white coaching candidate. You might belong to the same fraternity, or your father might belong to the fraternity, right? Or, right, I'm a big fan. John Elway won us a couple of championships, and I have an affinity for John. And if John has an affinity for you, I'm more willing to hire you. Right? And we're just talking about on a larger professional scale, right? What does that look like in the everyday of institutions? Hell, what does that look like at Duke?
Terms compatibility and fit come up, right?
Right.
You become a finalist, and then their justification is the fit just felt better.
Lack of disruption. And of course, this informal economy connects in another way. Mass incarceration. We have seen in this country 4 times the number of folks incarcerated since the 1970s over the last 40 years. How much of that incarceration has occurred in the context of the drug trade? And I say drug trade, but there's no drug trade in the hood. There's drug selling in the hood. 3 strikes rules, right, that were implemented in the mid-1990s. The increase of the incarceration of black and brown bodies. And again, mass incarceration in and of itself is not benign also.
The crack cocaine disparity.
Right, disparities between who gets arrested and for how long for possession of cocaine versus crack.
It's functionally the same drug.
Right.
One was in one community, and one was in the other.
Right. If you get caught with one, you get sent to drug counseling. You get caught with the other, you get sent to jail. And again, mass incarceration is not benign. Mass incarceration in this country, in the world, is big business. If you are one of those rural towns, it's the work of my man John Eason, who talks about the rural ghetto. If you're one of these rural towns that once had a factory, and that factory has closed, what's the best way to rebuild the economy of your town? Get a prison built there. And they have to hire prison guards. And they got to build the Wendy's and the Fridays, the Supercuts. A whole infrastructure is built around the creation of these towns that are built around these prisons. And the interesting irony is, as Eason talks about in his work, is you have these prisons in rural America in which the population within the prisons are 80% black and brown. So even in this context, right, when we see what the cycle is, right, it is not benign. Right? You don't have access to traditional jobs. You can't afford to live. There's a proliferation for some reason of drugs and guns in your communities. You get engaged in the informal economy. If you get arrested, you end up in mass incarceration. If you want to figure out what gangster rap is, gangster rap tells you that story. What we typically focused in on was the violence of those stories. So for a moment, we talked about what the ghetto is. What does ghetto pathology look like? What's the kind of behavior that we associate with the ghetto? And again, I'm being deliberate here. I'm not talking about the culture of the ghetto. I'm talking about behavior. And let's be honest, right? And I'll put it like in a way that some of you might understand. You know, I'm a not quite upper middle class, but not middle class. Right? Those housing projects that we were talking about, you know, both my wife and I grew up in housing projects, right? So, you know, I'm like this aspirational Negro. But if you're one of these aspirational Negroes, even if you're second and third generation, and we talked about this before, you got some cousins, Pookie, Nene. And even if you don't know firsthand what some of those pathologies may be, you know them through Pookie and Nene. right? And this is just another way for me to encourage you to be honest here. So what do we think about when we think about the ghetto as the pathologies of the ghetto? What kind of behaviors are we talking about? None of y'all want to answer.
What are stereotypes that come up?
What are some of the stereotypes that come out of life in the ghetto? Drug selling, violence, what else? Either want to be a rapper or play ball, right? Because the belief is that inside the ghetto, folks are anti-education and anti-intellectual. What else? Rob and steal, right? Though, of course, there's a context for that behavior. You don't have any money. Where else are you going to get money from? I'm just being honest there for a moment, right? We actually tend to attach much more pathology to people who rob without having money, as opposed to the people who rob us who have a bunch of money, like pharmaceutical companies. But anyway, yes. What's that? Pregnancy, right? High rates of pregnancies out of wedlock and teenage pregnancy. Yes? What's that? Acts of violence? Absent fathers, right? Absentee fathers, right? Yes.
Senseless violence.
Senseless violence, random and senseless violence, yes. Prostitution. What else? Everybody want to gangbang, right? Because what else are you supposed to be able to do? What else? Drug wars. What do people in the ghetto? Turf wars, right? What do people in the hood eat? What do people in ghettos eat? What's that? McDonald's, right? And again, oodles and noodles. All right, and let's talk about the McDonald's for a second, right? Because you could go to any urban community, and literally there will be 5 McDonald's and 1 supermarket if you're lucky. And if there is a supermarket, try to find the fresh fruit in the supermarket. So that eating fast food, nachos, pork rinds, right? And it's stuff that, the point that I'm not making is that this stuff doesn't occur, but it's not part of the culture of those communities. We're talking about behaviors in response to what life is in those particular communities. You want to jump in?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So we brought up we said, what were the trifecta? You had your pimps, the bitches, the hoes. So let's talk about gender. Okay, so these tropes that come around women in hip hop. Trisha Rose discusses patriarchy and sexism. What does sexism mean? What was the definition? She literally defined, took the dictionary definition and put it within the text. Her definition was domination over women, right? So then the question becomes, who is dominating women, right? So if we think of social hierarchy, and now we're thinking about these structures that affect the system, right? The racial hierarchy will always tell you that whites are on the top, black folks are on the bottom, and then you have a spattering of non-whites in the middle, right? So what does domination look like when you're in a community that is already being subjugated by outside forces? So what does domination look like when you are a man and a woman in a system that is already oppressing you, right? By these factors that we've discussed. So then, what does sexism look like when you layer that within the conversation? And then my bigger point, I think, is when some folks have cited Cardi B and Nicki Minaj. What makes Nicki Minaj or Cardi B different than Katy Perry in terms of their over-sexualization and their depictions in pop culture? Is Katy Perry a hip hop artist? I got some no's. Okay, so what makes our perception of hip hop culture sexualizing women different than pop culture? If we're going to presume hip hop culture is not pop culture, which generally now it is. So what makes Katy Perry different than Nicki Minaj? So we tend to sexualize black women a lot.
Yeah, or differently than where, and it's not that we don't, as a culture, sexualize white women. We sexualize them differently.
And I think with black women, we talked about teenage pregnancy, that goes into the trope we've talked about in class before of the welfare queen, right? We pathologize black women in a way that it's not just that they're sexualized, and they're also taking advantage of the system. When we're talking about the welfare queen, it's this presumption that there's no jobs, so all folks are doing are having babies and taking advantage of the government system to get some checks in the bank.
On welfare, right?
On welfare. And so this whole trope comes with it, right?
Let me ask you this question. Do you think that hip hop is misogynistic? Yes or no question? Yes. I think on some level, none of us would argue with the fact that there are aspects of hip hop that's sexist and misogynistic. Do we think that hip hop is an outlier in terms of aspects of American culture that's sexist and misogynistic? Do we think that hip hop is more misogynistic than other things that occur in American society? Anybody? So if I was to say to you that hip hop does the grunt work for American patriarchy, how would you respond to that? So let me give an example. Because hip hop, we know as a form, doesn't emerge until 1973. And so if we're going to place the responsibility of misogyny and sexism on hip hop, that means that hip hop must have been doing something disruptive in that period of time that didn't occur before hip hop. This is an outlier underground culture. This is mainstream American film. Major Hollywood stars in the 30s and the 40s and 50s. Violence against women was normalized, expected, a source of humor. So when we think about hip hop's role in the reproduction of sexism, misogyny in the culture, and how part of our immediate response is to think that hip hop is a culprit, we miss how misogyny and sexism functions in black communities. The other interesting dynamic of this is that while we perceive black men as being inherently sexist and misogynist, in most instances, if black men are sexist and misogynist, the victims of those black men are black women. But yet, alternatively, there is very little conversation about the victimization of black women in response to sexism and misogyny. So what does that look like in the context of hip hop? This was hip hop's come to Jesus moment around gender. Nelly, country grammar Nelly, so it wasn't like anybody was ever thinking about, Nelly who did a song with, Tim McGraw, right? Nelly's a pop star, right? He's not anybody Doug anything. But he makes a song called Tip Drill. And YouTube don't exist yet. So it's not like you could hop on YouTube and watch it. The only place that you can see Tip Drill is on BET. And BET had an after-hours show. And this is where this conversation gets complex because we tend to put a lot of responsibility on artists. But individual artists don't get their music played on the radio. Right? Individual artists aren't responsible for getting music played on BET. So BET had this after-hours show. Came on 2 o'clock in the morning. They showed all this soft porn, for lack of a better way to describe it. And there are lots of conversations we can have about this. We obviously can talk about the ways that it demean women, and there were also these concerns about who is watching it, though, you know, if your 10-year-old is up 2 o'clock in the morning watching these videos on BET, that's not necessarily a hip-hop problem, that's a parenting problem. That's a whole other conversation. And so Nelly debuted this video on this BET show. And nobody thought much about it because, one, that's what hip-hop videos look like at that period of time. Pull up any hip-hop video from a major hip-hop artist between 1998 and 2002. Big Pimpin', I mean, pull up any of those videos, right? They all look the same. In fact, we created celebrities of the women in this particular moment. Right? What was Superhead's name? I need some old folks here. Corinne Steffens, whose nickname was Superhead, the imaginative, right? Who wrote a tell-all book about all the hip-hop artists she was with, except for the ones who wrote her $1 million checks so that they wouldn't mention her in the book. And then there are the ones who wrote $1 million checks to make sure that they were mentioned in the book so that we might think about them differently. Melissa Ford, right, who was also a very well-known one, who actually had a degree from the University of Toronto, right, but had to do this for a living. Anyway, so Nelly does this video, and Nelly's sister is dying of a blood disorder. So he's traveling around the country to raise money and awareness around his sister's blood disorder. He comes to Spelman College, right, or at least plans to come to Spelman College. Spelman College, as you know, is an all-women's, historically black college and university in the city of Atlanta. Produced many great women thinkers and activists and artists. The young women at Spelman said to Nelly, "We would love to host a blood donor drive for you on our campus, but you have to sit down with the women on this campus and talk about the reasons why you make music videos like this." And though the narrative about the women at Spelman was in fact that, right, they denied Nelly access to come to the campus, it was actually Nelly who pulled out of the event because he didn't want to have to be held accountable for what he was producing in hip-hop. It changed the narrative around, right, sexuality and violence and misogyny in hip-hop, right? And again, this occurs 2 years after the R. Kelly initial tape starts to circulate, 4 years before he goes to trial, right? A year after he's indicted, 15 years before surviving R. Kelly shows up. And this is an important piece because even when we think about hip-hop being sexist and misogynistic, there are ways in which the only time we talk about sexism and misogyny in American culture is when we talk about it in hip-hop. And in fact, it is within hip-hop that you have the context of women and also men, like Byron Hurt, for instance, who are pushing back against sexism and misogyny in hip-hop. You think about this idea of ghetto pathologies, sexism, misogyny, and hip hop, and of course the use of violence, is that embedded in all of this, one is this concept, and I talked about this earlier, that hip hop and black folks in general are anti-intellectual and anti-education. What is striking is that because of this realism around the fact that we think that everybody comes from the hood and is uneducated, are the number of hip hop artists who actually have college degrees. So for example, Talib Kweli, right, earned a degree from New York University, right? We've talked about this before. His mother, Dr. Brenda Green, is a well-known literary scholar. The late Keith Guru Elam is a graduate of an HBCU, right, Morehouse. J. Cole, we know, went to St. John's. David Banner not only has a bachelor's degree from Southern University, but when his rap career hit, he was in a master's program at the University of Maryland. Chuck D, Public Enemy, graduated from Adelphi. What most folks don't know, and it's kind of hard to process, is that the reason why Chuck D knows Flavor Flav, because Flavor Flav was a graduate of Adelphi also. The group was founded on a radio show at Adelphi where both Chuck D and Flavor Flav were students and eventually graduates. Here in North Carolina, we know that Rhapsody graduated from NC State. Fonte Coleman graduated from North Carolina Central.
Does Judena count as hip hop?
What's that?
Does Judena count as hip hop?
Yeah.
University?
And speaking of North Carolina Central, shout out to Coach Lavelle Moulton. Hopefully they'll win tonight, so they got to play Duke on Friday. And then there's also this thing within hip hop that we also don't talk a whole lot about. Is that hip hop is also a space that encourages autodidacts. A lot of self-educated people within hip hop. The most well-known, of course, is KRS-One, right? Who famously, right, dropped out of high school when he was 14. Right? He's published like 4 books. And part of the reason why KRS-One dropped out of school is because he kept challenging the teachers, not physically, right? But because he was doing all this reading on his own, when teachers would teach stuff in the classroom, when he was disruptive, bringing his own set of knowledge into the classroom, the teachers were both offended and threatened, and so he couldn't stay in the classroom, right? And of course, if you think about what hip hop is, and for all the negative things that we attach to it, one of the critical aspects when we talk about those pillars of hip hop, right? Making beats, rapping, breakdancing, graffiti art, this idea of knowledge or consciousness, right? Hip hop has always been an intellectual space, right? That's trying to process some of these issues. Before we take a break, I want to leave you with this one clip from Sarah Jones. And again, the way that hip hop embedded in itself speaks back to the reality of sexuality and misogyny, patriarchy, and sexism. That was Miss Sarah Jones, who famously did a one-person play in the late 1990s in which she critiqued hip-hop. And as the story goes, in one of her performances, Mr. Carter was sitting in the front row. And he thought about, the kind of challenges that someone like Sarah Jones was posing. And this is a point, right? When we talk about hip-hop feminists, for instance, when Joan Morgan visits us in 2 weeks, right, and she literally is seen as kind of the mother, right, the mother figure of hip-hop feminism is not divorced from hip-hop, right? So what you have in hip-hop is, in fact, an infrastructure that actually deals with the realities of violence and sexuality, patriarchy, misogyny, right, ghetto, quote-unquote, pathology. All right. And what happens is very often the mainstream has no inkling of this. think about what for you are the most resonant ideas of what hip hop is and where those ideas circulate. And if you think about that, how does the mainstream even think about black people in that context? Do we ever see in mainstream culture the nuance of black identity? Right? The fact that not only do some people think that every rapper comes from the hood, we think that every black person comes from the hood. Not only are we willing to make certain kind of critiques of how we think that, for instance, right? Y'all know about the acting white thesis? Some of you in the room have probably been accused of it at some point. Two researchers, Professor Fordham and Professor Agbu, they did a very well-known study in 1986, at least it was published in 1986. And their thesis was that black kids underperform in school on purpose for fear of being labeled acting white by their black peers. One of the reasons why the study could resonate and in fact be incredibly influential was this basic belief that black communities were anti-education. Now, of course, there's enough data to suggest an alternative to that, like the dozens upon dozens of historically black colleges and universities that, for instance, were set up specifically for the education of black folks. If black folks were anti-intellectual or anti-education, these institutions would not be able to sustain themselves as they have, in some cases, for more than a century. But this idea was that black kids underperform in school because they don't want to be called by their peers who are anti-intellectual and educated that they're acting white. And the worst thing, of course, apparently, that you could say to a black kid was that you're acting white. Such was the thesis. Lots of folks have undermined the thesis, including Duke's own Sandy Darity, when he's not, of course, talking about reparations. By the way, if you got a chance to watch C-SPAN tomorrow morning at 8:30, Sandy Darity will be on Washington Journal talking about reparations, but anyway. Or John Jackson, who is the dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at Penn, former Duke professor. One of the things that John Jackson talked about, for instance, in this acting white thesis, is that it presumes that the only way that a black kid could be black would be in the classroom. As if a black kid couldn't dress black, talk black, though language is a little questionable thing in this context, that he might not listen to black. There's so many other ways to be black other than before how you perform in school. And of course, the conversation didn't seem to lead us as to the reasons why black kids might in fact underperform in school. Lower expectations, right? You're the black kid in class, raise your hands, the teacher never calls on you, right? Where your white peers, when you answer a question, get follow-up questions to push you someplace, your white teacher, and more than other instances, your black teachers don't ask those follow-up questions, don't push you to do something else. The interesting discrepancy between black kids and brown kids who get out-of-school suspensions versus in-school suspensions, and even the comparison of the number of days in which black kids are out, and all this stuff is documented. So much documented that, like in the city of Durham, right, they don't want to talk about out-of-school suspensions, so they talk about restorative justice. So that there's not a stigma associated to the fact or the reality that there's always a racial discrepancy in multiracial schools between black kids, right? And why do black kids get kicked out first? Well, you know, black girls get pushed out of schools because they talk back, they attempt to defend themselves, right? And of course, what we hear in hip hop, whether we're talking Rappacy or MC Lyte or Queen Latifah or Cardi, could you imagine what Cardi B was in the classroom? Right? Because what we know about Cardi B, whatever we might think about it, given the career that she has, is that she's brilliant. But what does that look like in the classroom if she doesn't talk the way a teacher thinks that she should talk? Or she doesn't dress the way that a teacher thinks that she should dress? Right? And of course, black boys in the classroom are just threats. Too big, too loud, perception's always already a criminality. Right? So are kids being anti-intellectual or anti-educational, or are they simply exhibiting behavior in the environments in which they hope to be educated?
Or exceeding expectations. So two things came to mind. One, who here has been accused of plagiarism for writing too well? So that tends to happen a lot with students of color.
That happens at Duke. Those of you who were around for the 50th anniversary of the Allen Building takeover, one of the young men, not young anymore, who took over the Allen Building told the story about a teacher who ignored him because he didn't think he could write. And then when he wrote a paper for him that exceeded his expectations, he accused the student that his white roommate had written his paper. I could tell you dozens of stories of black, now faculty, who were in graduate school, who were told by their white professors that they didn't write their papers. Right? So that's the reality of what we're talking about here, right? And even in the context of acting white and this idea that black spaces and black communities are anti-intellectual and anti-educational, right? The data doesn't suggest that. Look around the room as just one example of this. Look around the room now and why the room looks like this now and why the room didn't look like this 55 years ago. And it has nothing to do about the educational capabilities of the black students who are in the room now and the black students who couldn't be in the room 55 years ago. So hip hop, as a cultural phenomenon, forces us to think about all of these things in sometimes uncomfortable ways. But yet, when we think about what hip hop is, right, we think Drake. Right, we think Weezy. Give me some of the names of the folks that y'all like, because I can't keep up with all of them. All right. J. Cole. Right. I mean, y'all say Kendrick and J. Cole like, I mean, y'all say that like 16-year-olds are listening to J. Cole and Kendrick. Right? Y'all listen to J. Cole and Kendrick, right? But y'all are college students, right? Everyday folks, right, who just want to bang some shit. They ain't listening to J. Cole and Kendrick. They ain't listening to Melly. They ain't listening to 21 Savage, right? Who now we want to claim as conscious now. They ain't listening to Migos. 3 years ago, they were listening to Yachty, Lil Duval. Right? I mean, that's who folks are listening to. Right? And what does it mean that those are the most representative figures of the culture for us now, as opposed to folks who are actually dealing with deep nuance? I mean, Wayne is an old man in hip hop now. Think about that for a second. Common was your uncle 5 years ago. He damn near your grandfather now. Chuck D, your great-grandfather. Flavor Flav, your crazy great-grandfather. Jay-Z, the cool uncle, right? But only the part of him where you might get in the car and run around and look at some honeys, right? That's the part of Jay-Z, the old Jay-Z that people actually like, right? They don't want to hear him pontificate about black businesses, right? Or the fact that he needed to go to therapy, right? Because he wasn't a good husband and father. Anyway, y'all take a break.